and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What are we going to do with all of this life everywhere? And how can we science the hell out of it? I'm very excited to have our guest on today. Before I introduce him, I want to make sure you know who I am. I am Richard Littauer. I am your only host today. If you see any of my other hosts in the wild, please accost them and tell them, go host more podcasts, because I always like talking to them too. But I'm totally fine today because I have an amazing guest. I'm joined by Yehudi, calling in from Cambridgeshire, UK. Yo, how are you doing today?
I'm marvelous, actually. And whilst I am in the UK and it is great, it's also really, really warm. So couldn't be better.
Yo is joining us today because they are the executive director for OLS, Open Life Science, I believe.
You are doing well. We converted to OLS when we realized we weren't doing only life science. And we were like, no one knows what IBM stands for. So we can go by OLS, but we still end up unpacking it every time anyway.
That makes sense to me. Okay, I feel better because it used to be very easy to say, and now it's OLS, but I'm never really sure what that means. So Open Life Science, as well as being part of Open Life Science, Yo is a Software Sustainability Institute Fellow. That's the SSI. They're the best. A NASA TOPS grantee, a Research Software Alliance Steering Committee member, and recently defended a doctoral thesis studying human factors in research software and open communities, focusing kind of on sustainability. So very looking forward to this conversation. I think it should be really, really fun. Previous roles for Yo include being the editor of the PLOS Open Source Toolkit, Code First Girls coding instructor, Mozilla volunteer, editor emeritus for JOS, open board member of the Open Bioinformatics Foundation, basically done all the things all the time. Now, Yo, you are the executive director for OLS, which means that you have to constantly give the elevator pitch for what OLS is and does. In fact, you have to plan that to make sure that it does it well. Can you tell me, what is OLS?
Sure. In a sentence or two, it is an organization that's dedicated to helping scientists share their work with the world. You might say, what, you mean scientists don't share their work with the world? And you'd be surprised that all too often a scientist might leave academia, and if they didn't move the data off their hard drive, it's gone. And it's not that they didn't want to share, it's just that it never even occurred to them.
Excellent. That's a really great mission. I totally understand that. Having been through academia, the amount of ways that scientists don't share are infinite and just sad. I wish we shared more. Now, is this what you meant when you said that OLS is bigger than just life sciences? Now you're focused on all of science, not just on this particular branch.
Pretty much. I'd even go so far. Science sometimes can be a restrictive term because humanities may or may not count themselves as part of that, or social science. But we've worked with archaeologists, with linguists, with people working in law, and they all share the same challenges, which is that actually sharing your work is not straightforward. There's some things you shouldn't be sharing, some things you should. And so it made sense to expand it beyond the life sciences, which is where we originally started to focus.
I love that. Now, when we talk about sharing your work, obviously there's a rigorous way to share work in sciences, right? Which is the peer-reviewed publication, the most important and sole way to share work, as we all know. Can you tell me about why that's the wrong statement and what other ways people should share?
Even though, Richard, I know you were being absolutely sarcastic there. So yeah, if you sort of picture, I don't know, some gentleman sitting in tweed with some leather patches on his elbows, writing a monograph that he shares with many people. That may be what you imagine people do with science, but actually science is like almost everything else we see. And the reason that I'm on an OSS podcast, in fact, is because science uses a lot of code. And so in science, people use code to create outputs, to visualize the work that they're doing, to understand things. So we've seen things like AI predicting cancer-related outputs, for example. So basically code and computation comes into science in so many different ways. And it's actually a big challenge to make sure that we're sharing all of this. I've even seen on academia.stack exchange someone saying, hey, I've just tried to publish my work and the reviewer wanted to see the code for my work. Is this normal? And in my head, I'm like, well, if you said to a mathematician, let's say the answer is 42, would say, we want to know what all those calculations were. that went into that. So why is it so surprising when we ask for that in code to do the science? We want to know whether the science is correct and what calculations went into it. And if it's wrong, we want to be able to fix it. And so open code is actually super, super important for science. And it should be something that's peer reviewed as well as just, and I'll put this in quotes, just the manuscript. And besides that, we also have a lot of collaborative co-creation, or we can in science. It doesn't have to be the ivory tower and the gentleman sitting alone in his armchair, but we can be involving people who have maybe no experience in the scientific method, but who are coders, for example. So there's lots and lots of different ways that science has a really big overlap with code. Did I veer off the question too much, or was that okay?
No, that answered it perfectly. It actually raised another question for me, which is good. That's how all conversations should go, which is, how do you define scientists, right? A lot of times people may be working in large institutions, maybe with an undergraduate, maybe with a high school, maybe just an elementary school background, who do work that is basically science work. They have a problem, they solve the problem, then they share the solution so other people can do that too. In your work, is there any sort of distinction that you make between different groups of people, whether they're open sourcey or sciencey?
Not really. So the easy, traditional, and dare I say, slightly lazy way to define a scientist is someone who has a PhD or maybe a permanent research position at a university. So I have been, of course, bucking the trend as much as I could. So by the time that I'd worked in academia for 5 years, I still didn't have a PhD. In fact, I didn't even have a bachelor's when I first started working at Cambridge at the Department of Genetics as a software engineer. But I did have the skills that I needed, which were to do with maintaining an open source biological database and the coding that was required around that, mostly UX, UI, front end kind of things. So I would say what defines a scientist is curiosity and rigor. So being interested, being excited by how the world works, and being willing to examine it in some sort of systematic way.
I like that definition because it also excludes a lot of fussy old scientists who really shouldn't be doing their work anymore. That's a hot take, but just saying, people who are curious, people who are rigorous, that's a great definition. Now, given that that sounds to me like a massive amount of scope creep for OLS, how many people are working at OLS, and how do you figure out what you actually do on a day-to-day basis?
You sound a little bit like my governance team. That's okay. They do a great job. And I appreciate everything they do so much. So we actually have some guiding pillars of what we care about. And so what we started was, hey, let's run an open science training program. And very early on, after we had been training people, we realized that that was good. And that was part of what we needed to do, but it wasn't going to solve the whole thing, the whole reason that we existed, which was basically to help people share and to build community around what they were doing. Because if someone says, yeah, this is great, and they go through the training and mentoring 16 weeks where they're learning about all the different types of open science and how to embed equity and diversity and inclusion into what they're doing, and things like community building, personas and pathways, like loads of good practices that we sort of give them like 10 minutes on each thing just so they know it exists and they can find out more on their own. But then they're like, okay, cool, I've started my project. I don't have a home for it. Maybe I don't have a university I'm attached to, or I've never run a business before. What do I do next? So that sort of helped us design our next, dare I say, scope creep, which was incubating people and incubating projects. And then the third part of the way we decide what we're scoping for is evidence around open community behaviors. So we focus on research, which is, I'm a meta-researcher. Technically, my degree is in computer science, but most of my work has been interviews and talking to people and relatively little code. But I want to understand effective ways to build community, to work openly, rather than the anecdotal stuff and the things that I've tried and seem to work. I want to get evidence and understand what makes communities online working together tick, and what makes them safe and what makes them healthy. And just so to recap, we try and stick to the 3 areas in our scope. That's the training and mentoring, that's the research, and that's the incubation of some of the projects that have spawned from the training and the mentoring. And we feel like that sort of creates a holistic picture that tries to prevent the scope creep, because sometimes it's too easy to hear, hey, there's a grant coming up, apply for it. And then you run down that rabbit hole and then emerge 6 months later saying, did this help me at all?
Tell me a bit about the size of the team and the size of your funding.
So right now, I think we have somewhere between 10 and 13 people in the team. Most of these people are part-time. Everyone except one person is paid. We argued quite hard with the one fellow who asked not to be paid before he said, yes, I want to be an unpaid fellow because I care about your work very much. But we actually have a team that's built all around the world. We have several people based in Nigeria. We have someone in Argentina, in Mexico, Europe, the United Kingdom. I'm probably missing, and the United States. If I'm missing anyone beautiful, I'm so, so sorry.
And what does your funding look like?
We went from volunteer, 100% volunteer early on, and we were very lucky to be able to shape this and grow slowly in a staged way that made sense. So first of all, we applied for some smaller grants around 10,000 USD or 20,000 euros, things like that, which basically taught us how to go from a 100% volunteer organization to being able to start paying our volunteers. But we were still all the organizers were doing this for free. And then at some point, we realized that we were going to not be sustaining ourselves, dare I say. We were burnt out. I remember really, really worrying at the point when I had a doctoral research that I was working on, a full-time job, and this basically a startup that I had just, not-for-profit startup that I had founded whilst doing my doctorate and a full-time job. And it's no surprise I was exhausted. And that doesn't sound like a very good pitch. Hey, we're really tired, we're doing good work. But actually, it somehow did seem to work. And around the same time, we had our initial real funding come in with about £100,000 from the Wellcome Trust based in the United Kingdom and slightly over $500,000, nearly 0.6 million from CZI. So we're actually at the point where that's wrapping up, and we are working on contracts and other sources and other grants since at similar scales. And it's nice to still be going and to look back and actually realize we are almost 5 years old from when we started daydreaming about this. And we've transitioned to actually being able to pay pretty much everyone we work with, which does make a big difference when it comes to sustainability.
That's amazing. When you're looking for funding, I often find you have to differentiate yourself from everyone else, right? To point out how you're going to do a better job for the money that someone is trying to spend. Now, this is really hard in the space in the past 10 years because there's a lot of really interesting, awesome projects. What differentiates OLS from, say, the Open Knowledge Foundation or the Software Sustainability Institute or RISA, right? Research Software Alliance, or the Research Data Alliance, or open science as a general field? What is OLS fitting in as a niche? And how do you see yourself as different from, I don't want to say competitors, but potential collaborators who may take up some of the grant?
I love the way you phrased that because you correctly anticipated that if someone says competitive to me, I say they're only a competitor if they refuse to collaborate. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a good question. And we do try to collaborate with people as much as possible. Insofar as if we detect that we're working on what's actually a very similar space, we tend to reach out and chat and understand what the differences are with the people that we're working with. So, for example, actually, this is still something that's in the works, but not that long ago, when I say we, myself and a group of other organizations that work on science-related and computer-related training, we sort of said we should have an alliance where we can talk about disambiguating ourselves and also signposting each other and saying, hey, this is an organization that we know, that we care about. They do X, which we don't do. So if you're looking for X, go to them. But if you're looking for what I do, come to me, please. So the sort of joint signposting towards each other. In terms of what makes us different, it's largely the way we run our training and mentoring. So we pay all volunteers, anyone who does more than half an hour's work is paid to speak or to mentor the people who are participating in the training, and a very, very serious equity focus. And we know we can't get everything right, but we do our best to learn from what we've been doing, and we do our best to actually change and remove the barriers that we can remove, which is part of the reason that I think we have between nearly 60 countries represented in our community. So one of the first things that we recognized after being able to pay people was also that people may not even be able to afford to participate. So if I had even more money than I had today, I would be paying fellowships to every person who went through the 16-week training. I don't have that much yet. If anyone wants to fund it, please do call me. But what we do at the very minimum right now is that we offer money to unblock barriers. So for example, if someone doesn't have childcare or a headset or high-speed internet, then we offer micro grants to support them with relatively few quibbles. I won't say no quibbles, because if someone says, hey, I really, really need these AirPods, I'll be like, actually, I think that there are probably cheaper wireless headsets that will still do a great job. But within that, we tend to do our best to make sure that we financially remove those blockers from people. And it can even be things like power, like, do you need diesel for your generator? And I hope we sort of give a human touch that makes us valuable and makes some of the relationships between mentors and mentees much more long-lasting. Give me a few weeks and I can point you to a preprint that one of my colleagues is going to be releasing, which has been an impact study on our work, which really does talk about what differences make us special, but it's still like being written furiously behind the scenes right now. You can actually see smoke flying off Paz's fingers.
I'm noticing that this podcast takes longer than half an hour and kind of is work for OLS. So I'm looking forward to my large check in the mail. I love the idea of paying volunteers. One of the things that's hard for me to understand is how you reconcile that with the story you told earlier of you doing the startup on the side, part-time, unpaid. How do you decide to limit work when you don't have funds in your executive charter for where you want to go? How do you tell people, actually, can you stop working because I won't be able to pay you for that? And is this ever a question which has come up?
Not really. The one thing that someone in my governance recently pointed out is some people don't need more money and they do wish to volunteer. So if that's what works best for them as part of the value exchange, then I'm very happy to accept that, so long as it doesn't mean at any point that I'm doing something which I think, unfortunately, a lot of organizations are guilty of, which is exploiting free labor.
So that was my next question. And this is all in my head, listeners, related to open source, because this is very similar in the sense that this is also work that helps out open source, but this is still a project that's volunteer driven, that's towards a noble goal with people coming and joining. And so I'm seeing these questions sort of serving a dual purpose here. It's really easy to say we're going to pay people and we're going to pay people who ask for money. It's also very hard sometimes to get people to say, oh, I could get paid for that. Or, oh, I do need wireless headphones. That would really help me. But I'm not going to ask your project for that. I'm too proud, or that's not your scope. It's my own thing. Or I'll use it mainly for listening to lo-fi beats to work and study to. And that's not really work related. And so my question is, what do you do within your project to help combat internalized capitalist propaganda around how we should always do what we love and also not ask too much, not be too greedy? It's really tough, right? I'm not trying to be a red shirt communist here. I'm trying to say that we have these ways of existing in the world around money, and it's a hard thing to talk about, particularly in volunteer projects. So how do you help people make that easier besides just being open and friendly, unless that's the only answer you have?
It's not the only answer we have. I would love to actually do more research into this to understand different ways. I mean, it sounds hilarious that a question even is, how do you give money away? Right? But you are right that there is absolutely an internalized belief that standing on your own 2 feet means you're more deserving. And we have found that the way we ask makes a difference. So early on, the first time or two when we found we had some money available, we had a very low uptake, which was surprising. And we changed the way we asked it. And then we had much higher uptake to the point where the underspend became an overspend. So early on, we were like, if you need this, ask us. And some people did, and a lot of people didn't. But then at some point later, we actually embedded it when you're registering for the cohort. We say, tell us what you need. And for some reason, making that part of a whole set of questions around the registration, and maybe even not making it like a special exception, but something that every single person has to answer, makes a very big difference for the uptake. And so that would be my advice if anyone else is running a program like that, is experiment and make it really easy, but also make it clear that you're flexible depending on what people need. So early on, I think we said, we don't want you to have to spend money and get reimbursed because we know that'll be inconvenient. But then we found out that for some people, it is more convenient. And for other people, neither option was any good. Whether we ask them, send us a link on the internet and we'll ship it to you, but actually that post is non-existent. So we had to also offer the option of just giving the money up front. And like you mentioned, there's this sort of internalized capitalist bias of, what if people misuse this? And it can be really hard to get over that and just say, we're just going to trust you. And worst case, the worst thing that happens is you've run off with £100, euros, dollars, whatever it may be. But actually, in the scheme of things, who cares? Worst case, you've made someone's life $100 better, right? That is the worst case.
I like that. Let's take a bit of a left turn here. So we've talked a bit about your project and how governance works and all those things, and that's great. Let's talk about what you actually do to help out open source practitioners, scientists who are publishing open source. Now, how do you suggest that they publish their work and their code more effectively for recognition, for uptake, for citations? What do you do on that front?
There's a lot of resources out there, to be honest, and I don't want to we just go through a list of specific ones that actually might. But what I will say is if people are curious about the answers to these questions, either to sign up for one of our next cohorts or to go and look at our video library on YouTube, because we get different speakers every time. We've run 8 cohorts so far, so we have a lot of copies of videos that go over exactly this with full edited transcripts. So they are hopefully reasonably deaf and hard of hearing friendly as well. But my recommendation is to be flexible and thoughtful, really, genuinely, but share as much as you can, so long as you are not abrogating privacy, but also to consider things that may not be obvious. Like, for example, I've heard people say, but code of conduct reports should all be open, right? If we're going to be radically open. But it's like, well, who's going to approach you about something bad that's happened? Nobody. Or even you mentioned yourself asking for money to help pay for headphones or diesel for your generator. It can be shaming. So we could have thought about publishing names or blogs from people who receive microgrants, but we decided that actually we're more likely to get uptake if we make it without those kinds of awkward burdens from someone who, honestly, if they can't afford a headset, the last thing they need is more work to write a blog or something about it, right?
I hear that. Just to get a bit more specific, you have 8 different cohorts of videos online. What has been exciting and what's changed from the first one to the last one in terms of these projects? Is there anything that in the last few years you've started saying, I love the code of conduct example is a great example. No, they shouldn't all be public, because then the people who are coming and saying, hey, this was a problem for me, are publicly available to be doxxed, et cetera, et cetera. What other tips do you have for people to publish open source code that are just different than, say, what we knew 5 years ago?
I'm going to say there's some things we used to teach, and I'm going to say this is embedded into open source code. I can see some people might fight me on it, but thinking about equity and unconscious bias. So we used to teach an unconscious bias lesson where we tell people, hey, this is a thing, try and work against it. These days, we talk more about equity more generally in your communities, trying to build welcoming communities. But when we can, we try and get people to focus more on the experience of a marginalized person. And this is largely because a marginalized person who's being edged out of an open source community doesn't care whether it's an unconscious or conscious bias when it's happening. I'm trying to think another one that this is probably one more for the science crowd than the open source crowd would be that we didn't actually teach about open access very much early on. And just to unpack what open access means, that tends to be when a scientist publishes their paper, they have 2 options. They either publish it without paying anyone, but anyone who wants to read the article, they have to pay money, which means that only the rich can see the science. Or the modern option is open access, which is where the scientist pays to publish an article. And that means anyone can see the science, but only the rich can publish. So neither option is great. They all, at the end of the day, require that someone has money who may not have money. But we didn't even teach about that at the start, because there was a point when early on in open science, people would say that was what open science was, and they weren't thinking about the data or the code or the process. But actually, at some point, we realized that we still do need to teach it. even though open science is so much more than that. But that was mostly maybe an oversight from us, where we were thinking it was so obvious that that was open that no one needs to be taught it. But actually, even the obvious stuff needs to be taught sometimes.
When we think about publishing, I love what you just said about only the rich can publish or only the rich can access. That's a really good way of breaking down the difference between some of these things. What about throwing everything into arXiv and GitHub and then walking away? That's another option where you don't have to publish it formally and other people can access it accessibly. Why isn't that the best option for scientists come open source people?
Honestly, I think it can be a good option. I mean, again, I'm going to always put the little star off so long as that's done responsibly. If you're doing personal interviews with someone and they could get in trouble or reveal embarrassing things, for example, but not be putting that data on GitHub or someone's personal addresses. There's so much that we shouldn't be putting on GitHub. And arXiv, you can publish just about anything for free. The reason that scientists usually don't do that is that it may or may not be useful or counted as useful when they are applying for jobs at universities. But if it works for you, if that system works for you, that's fine. I mean, honestly, I don't see any reason to fuss.
Because of the position you sit in, I'm curious about whether you think there's a similarity between scientists who have to do all this extra rigmarole in order to get a job up in the future when they could just put it on arXiv. They could just publish it on their blog. And that's also science, right? It doesn't have to be stamped with Oxford to be good. Sometimes that's the opposite. And open source people who don't have to be on the biggest project ever that just won a grant from Google to continue going. They don't have to be the best thing in the ecosystem forever, but they still need to get a job. They still need to show that they are experienced at what they do to convince their managers that they're worth keeping around. Do you think there's a similarity? And
I feel awfully like I have spent a lot of time showing my colors, my rather anti-capitalist colors recently. But I would need to maybe circle back to that again and just suggest that whilst I am very anti-capitalist, I also live in this world. And I think one of those things that means that you sometimes have to work with the system in order to change it. If I call for radical reform, not much will happen except that people say I'm a radical reformist. However, if I actually try and model the changes I want to see, but don't guilt people for having to live in this world and having to be paid, even though I don't agree with capitalism as a general concept, or having to get a job and therefore they must publish in Nature or Science, or working for a corporate organization that doesn't do open source. It's not that bad. Of course, you've got to pay your bills. And honestly, I'm still on the fence about the fact that open source really was founded pragmatically as a way to exploit free labor. Makes me uncomfortable as a general rule.
well, I agree with that completely. I also think there's a distinction that's important to be made between capitalism as using large amounts of money and investing it to basically get more profits without doing any labor yourself, and just working hard and getting paid for it. Just working as part of the system isn't necessarily capitalist. It can actually be quite nice. And so a lot of open source maintainers are doing that sort of work and are just part of, I have a small startup and there's 5 of us and we do open source work and we also get paid for our stuff. I think that's fine.
Exactly. So, you put it really well.
In that case, again, I'm always trying to not make sure that this isn't an anti-institution podcast. There are awesome people working on open source elsewhere in places which are awesome. Mozilla is a really good example. So I think we should continue to praise their work. Taking another turn, I know that you've worked on open source longevity. Can you talk a bit about that?
Thank you for asking me about my favorite study. So I'm very lucky because I've just finished my doctoral degree rather. And the last study that I did as part of that was year-long, where about 40 open source projects signed up to be tracked on GitHub over a year. And they also answered 3 surveys at the start, at the middle, and at the end. So month 0, 6, and 12. And what I was hoping to find in this was these projects failed and they were really bad at this particular, pull request metric. And these projects lived and they were really good at these metrics. And basically what I wanted was one of those machines where you put in a GitHub URL. And then as maybe an open source funder, whether that's corporate or something else, that you say, okay, these are good ones, I should fund them. And these are bad, so I shouldn't fund them. Or maybe these ones are struggling, so I should fund them. So there's different ways of thinking about it. And after a year, I'm sitting here and my thesis is like tick, 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 looming over me. And I can just hear that clock. And I'm looking at my data and I'm just like, I cannot see it. I cannot see any of these. It didn't help that, of course, actually, of the 40 projects, only one closed down, and that was a planned close down. I mean, I was delighted, right? I don't ever want a good, successful project to have to shut down, but it did mean I didn't have any failure data. But after spending so much time saying all I see is chaos in this data, and that's chaos with only one S rather, I realized that was the story. That what we're looking at here is we're trying to, I mean, if you know the story of the drunkard search, as they call it, it's about a guy who's quite drunk and a policeman walks up to him at night and sees him searching under a lamp. And he says, "What's wrong?" And he says, "I'm looking for my keys." And the policeman says to the guy, "Where did you lose your keys?" And he says, "Over there, but the light's better here, so I'm searching here." And that's really often what we're doing with GitHub, right? Because, or choose your open source version control platform and collaboration platform here, is that we really, really want to understand things. But what we're looking for is social metrics in something that's basically about code. So I had so many examples where, let's say, the person who leads the project never committed a line of code because they were out selling and talking to people, and they had a lot of authority and a lot of say, but their name was not on the project. And so many other scenarios where every time you say, well, maybe this is a rule, then I'd say, actually, but this is a project that's 30 years old that doesn't obey that rule, but clearly is sustainable because it's a 30-year-old project. And the main thing that I found was that there aren't any rules observable in GitHub around the metrics that I'd measured. It was really exciting, really good fun, but I think that no one wants to hear it if I say that using GitHub as a way to predict sustainability is a bad idea. They're just like, no, there must be something. But honestly, we need to be looking at the social behaviors. And Julia Ferroli, I think, did a great keynote at ChaosCon where she said something about putting the social into socio-technical. And I could not phrase it better than she did. It's just perfect. We spent too much time looking at the technical and ignoring the other evidence because it's hard to look at and hard to understand.
I was thinking of Julia and also Amanda Casari, who has sort of done work on this before. And I guess since you've been sitting for so long on such a long piece of document on your thesis, congratulations on finishing. I am curious what you would suggest to open source practitioners or to open source policy advisors who work with practitioners on how they can build more sustainable communities without looking continually for the keys in the wrong place. Are there any quick tips that you got in your conclusion section of your thesis that you would like to share? You only have 20 seconds, so make it quick.
Well, it's the 5 tips to lose belly fat. Yeah, I've got those. Right in the clickbait. I genuinely don't. I've looked a lot of places and said, this is where we shouldn't be looking. I can also say, if you want to learn more things about the community side, OLS does some great training around that. But honestly, I don't think there's any quick and easy ones beyond making sure that you have functionable, friendly humans and not just infighting in your project.
I actually think that's a pretty good tip and also probably a good thing to end on. Did you defend your thesis already?
It's defended, and as of about 3 weeks ago, no amendments required. I'm Dr. Me, and I'm so happy.
Congratulations. That's amazing. Where can people learn more about your work and about this thesis if they wanted to read it?
They can visit yo-yehudi.com. And by the time the podcast comes out, I will have made sure I've linked to that properly with all of my research papers.
There's the old joke about the car mechanic's shop is always really dirty, or the cobbler's kids have no shoes. But one hopes that the ED of OLS knows how to share the science that they're doing. So good luck with that. Where can I learn more about OLS?
Openlifesci.org. That's sci.org.
Thank you so much. Don't leave yet. Spotlight is a part of the show where we talk about other projects, people, or things that we think need a bit more light shed on them that we are just excited about. My spotlight today is going to be a book because I think books are excellent. And I'm going to spotlight Joseph Banks. There's a biography of Joseph Banks by Patrick O'Brien, who, as longtime listeners may know, wrote the amazing Aubrey Maturin series set in the Napoleonic Wars. But he also wrote this lovely biography of one of my favorite scientists. He wasn't always great. He was a product of his time. He overutilized draftsmen who then didn't get any credit for their work. But he was a really, really interesting botanist and went on to become the president of the Royal Society. And I just highly suggest checking out Patrick O'Brien's quite detailed and quite human portrait of a life, the ups and downs and how it went. So that is my spotlight today. That was the first biography I read when I was like 10, and it stuck with me all these years. Yo, what is your spotlight?
I would like to just spotlight InterMine. So that's at intermine.org. And it's the project that took me from believing that open source was kind of naive and not something that was really practical that anyone could do to having been paid for 5 years to work on open source and learning about bringing in new contributors and what a delight it was. And without that, I definitely wouldn't be where I am today because I learned so much. So maybe you too are looking for a biological data warehouse for your genomics and proteomic data. If you are, you should check it out.
All right. Thank you so much. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you have, there's a few things you can do. One, you can publish all of your work, including your code and data and so on, and do it in a way that's really awesome and other people can access it. And if you need help on that, you can go to OLS. 2, you can share this podcast wherever you're listening. 3, you can go to opencollective.com/sustainoss and pay us for this work, particularly Paul and Deanne, our editors. Also, I've now had 2 30-minute blocks of time on this podcast, so I'm looking forward to that check. You don't have to do anything, just a joke. But also, listeners, it would be really, really great, particularly if you have, say, people above you who have larger checks that they could spend. That's not your money because you're awesome. You can send us comments. Go to podcast@sustainoss.org. That is an email that will go to me. Let me know what you think. And you can also go on our discourse, also at sustainoss.org, and learn more there. Yo, thank you so much. Best of luck with everything. Now that you have endless amounts of free time after your dissertation is done, I'm excited to see what's going to come up next. And thank you once more.
It's been a pleasure.